So I'm Sharon Cavallaro, and I work for the State Performance Plan Technical Assistance Project. We are funded through the California Department of Education through a grant with Napa County office, working on disproportionality and significant disproportionality within our schools in California. We ask that you please post in the chat box your name, your LEA, organization, agency, university. Go ahead and share with us the names of those who may be sitting with you, if there's more than one of you sitting together today. And we'll go ahead and proceed. Some of the things that SPP-TAP does, in addition to holding webinars such as today's, are that we have online learning, and you can see the link there. We have a lot of information on our website, and we provide individualized technical assistance to LEAs and individuals who may have an interest in learning more about significant disproportionality and how to make changes. Today's webinar, we'd like to make it as interactive as possible, so feel free to use the chat box at any time. There will be certain times that we also ask you to type in on a whiteboard. Just to inform you that we do record SPP-TAP webinars for later publication for posting on our website. So just to give you the heads up that we do record these. And I want to tell you that I'm very pleased to introduce to you today's presenter, Dr. Sean Ginwright. Dr. Ginwright comes to us as a scholar, a practitioner, an author. He's a senior research associate and professor at the Cesar Chavez Institute for Public Policy at San Francisco State University. Dr. Ginwright is also the CEO of Flourish Agenda, which is a national nonprofit, and it's out of Oakland, but it serves the whole country in terms of building strategies for our children and youth to flourish. We're having this presentation, Healing Our School Communities, today. And again, we're grateful for Dr. Ginwright's time and efforts with us.
Great. Thank you, Sharon. It's a pleasure to be able to share these ideas with the State Performance Plan Technical Assistance Project. I really think that some of the ideas here can have currency not only for your students, but really focusing on the needs of really creating opportunities and strategies to support the social and emotional well-being of your teaching and adult staff in your school and learning communities. Just as a little bit of a backdrop, there are a number of challenges that schools and community-based organizations and educators are facing in relationship to equity. And oftentimes when we think about transforming or building strategies for equity in our school communities, we believe that building equity and addressing issues of equity are only about sort of the technical and mechanistic policy changes. But as we'll talk a little bit about in this presentation today, that a significant strategy or a significant part of creating equity and addressing various forms of inequality in our schools also requires for us to pay attention to the social emotional well-being of the adults in those schools and the teaching and the adult staff, and that our ability to create strategies and create supports often allow us to build teams that then make equity much more possible. So I want to go over some of the objectives for today's webinar. The first objective then is really to understand the causes of stress in school communities. We have and we live in a society where we believe that there's a distinction, a binary between your personal life and your professional life. And we also understand that those things converge oftentimes in our school communities, and that our schools sometimes don't have the supports to really address the causes of stress, particularly in low-income, under-resourced communities of color. The second objective is to explore the consequences of failing to support the social-emotional growth and development for teachers and administrators. As we'll talk about, one of the most significant challenges we're facing in California's teacher workforce is the shortage. And the research will show, and it is increasingly providing various data points, that the shortage is not simply a result of pay, or it's not simply a result of income. It's really a existential crisis. That is, the teachers are burnt out and stressed, and our schools and school communities haven't yet figured out how to support them. The third objective of today then is to introduce examples and strategies of how to build systems of support for the teacher and educational leaders, the workforce. How do we create opportunities to support the well-being in our school and school communities? So before we sort of go into the strategies, the question is what are some of the challenges to healing? What are some of the challenges to well-being in our systems? What are the causes of stress that young people and teachers are facing in our school communities? In the book, Hope and Healing in Urban Education, that I wrote, that came out a couple of years ago, one of the things that I documented in places like Chicago, here in Oakland, California, New York, and places from around the country, is that teachers and schools sometimes find themselves in very challenging environments. That is, young people come to school with various issues of trauma. Young people come to school with various issues of exposure to poverty, and that the educators themselves, while having deep care, empathy, and compassion for students, don't always oftentimes have the tools themselves to address it. And in fact, most of our schools tend to have the strategies that are predominant in our schools are discipline strategies. And as we'll see, that discipline strategies are really a function of addressing the symptom as opposed to the more fundamental root cause of the issues that are facing young people. But in the book, we also document the kinds of supports that the adults need, the teachers need, and how effective teachers are really reclaiming matters of the heart. That is, really reclaiming their own social emotional growth and development as a strategy and as a practice to be more present and to support young people. So how do we theoretically talk about the conditions then that cause stress and challenges for teachers and students in our school communities? The first piece of research comes from James Garbarino in a book that he titles Raising Children in a Socially Toxic Environment. And Garbarino raises a profound and I think very useful framework for us to understand the deep root causes of stress in our communities. He says that just like there are physical toxins in a building, in a home, or in an office, physical toxins are things like asbestos and lead paint. If you're exposed continuously to asbestos and lead paint, that ultimately that exposure to asbestos and lead paint, physical toxins, can make you ill. And if you're not healed or develop a process to address your exposures to those physical toxins, that those physical toxins can actually become lethal. They can kill you. Well, James Garbarino raises a similar, an equivalent argument. And he says that oftentimes we work, live, and play in a socially toxic environment. And a social toxic environment means that the environment that we work, there's high levels of stress, high levels of uncertainty, high levels of guilt, high levels of shame, high levels of insecurity. And he suggests that that working, playing, and living in these environments are toxic to one's well-being. It's toxic to building healthy, profound, courageous relationships with other adults, and it's toxic to building healthy relationships with young people themselves. So he argues that social toxins are things like as I said earlier, are things like stress, uncertainty, guilt, shame, insecurity. All of these things are just as significant. But if we don't have a way to identify and support them, they become increasingly toxic in our school communities and our neighborhoods. Here's some examples of social toxins. You remember perhaps the summer of 2016 and 17 where African-American young people, young men from around the country were being shot by police officers. The amount of fear and insecurity that parents faced and teachers faced about the safety of their own students and children, again, created a sense of uncertainty and a sense of stress that was embedded in that become embedded in young people's behaviors, in their relationships, and also with the adults. Right? I remember my own son, who is 6'3", leaving my home here in Oakland with a hoodie. And the amount of stress and concerns that I would always carry was not healthy for his own growth and development. Another example of social toxins, we can look at current discussions of immigrant families and immigrant communities and the policies that criminalize immigrants and provide undue amount of stress on immigrant families, where immigrant families are failing to or refusing to take their children to simple doctor's appointments for fear of deportation. The broader environment, as Gabarino suggests, intensifies these notions of social toxins in our communities and in our schools. So what is the result then of social toxins in our systems and in our school communities? What follows is, I think, a useful framework for us to think about how do we respond and how do we understand the way in which social toxicity shapes our individual well-being, but also the well-being of our collective school communities. You think about this is Mia. Mia is a teacher, an administrator, and a school leader. She cares deeply about working with young people and transforming their lives and supporting their healthy growth and development. But what Mia doesn't know is that when she goes to school and goes to her job, that she works in a socially toxic environment, that social toxins are like rain clouds. And unlike normal rain that gets us wet on the outside, these forms of social toxins don't just wet the outside of us, they actually get inside of us. And it becomes toxic to our own well-being. Stress, insecurity, fear, uncertainty, shame, guilt, all present themselves and have a way of getting inside of us, but and if we're not aware of the ways in which they're inside of us, they stay there and become increasingly toxic in our ability to be effective with young people and form meaningful, profound relationships. So when Mia is exposed to social toxins, it has an impact at three levels. It has an impact at the individual level of her own sense of well-being. Those social toxins also have an influence on the relationships that Mia is a part of. And those relationships, those teams of teachers and administrators and educational leaders, it has an influence on the institution where Mia works. And when the individual the interpersonal, and the institution itself is exposed to social toxins, the institution then develops values, policies, and practices that actually create more social toxicity. And the institution then itself then produces social toxins that ultimately go back out into society and create the cycle of social toxicity. So social toxins become cyclical in our society. They have an influence on our own individual well-being. They have an influence at our interpersonal, our relationships, our teams, how we relate to one another, our students, and how we relate to one another. It also becomes toxic at the very institutional, and the institution's policies, practices, and values. And so this framework allows us then to identify the ways in which social toxins shape us at the individual, interpersonal, and institutional level. What we'd like for you to do now is to think about this concept of social toxins in your own work. And Susan will explain and talk a little bit about, or explain how she wants us to share your own identification of toxicity in your own work.
Yes, and in just a moment, you should be seeing a toolbar up on the left side of your screen next to the PowerPoint. And if you look in that toolbar, it's a vertical one. The fourth item down is a text field. It's got a great big T. If you click on that and then you click on the slide in front of you, you will get a little field where you can type in your thoughts. So I'm going to write your thoughts on the screen. Then I have to click outside of that box in order to make it visible to everyone else. So go ahead and do that. We'll give you a few minutes to do that. And just so you know, I might move your words around because you're going to probably end up writing over each other, and that's okay. You might not see everybody's comments, but you'll see a good portion of them.
I'm going to just respond to a couple of the comments as I see them pop up. And I see some common responses to your to the question that we've posed for you, which is, you know, how do you identify social toxins and social toxicity in your work? The absence, and a couple of these say the absence of understanding teachers' complex lives, the need to punish students rather than to restore relationships, teacher-to-teacher and teacher-administrator interactions, providers having their own traumas they have not dealt with, and poor communication. These are really, really good examples. Teachers experiencing burnout, inability to perceive unwillingness of teachers and administrators to make decisions. I'm not sure if you've seen a recent article that just recently appeared in the New York Times over the weekend, and it simply argues that the most significant and important part of supporting education and learning for students is the relationship the students have with their teachers, and that the quality of the relationships teachers have with each other. I'm going to take a second to let Susan organize some of these sentences, and then we'll start back.
I will capture all of these for you, Sean, so you can go ahead and move on to the next slide.
Great. So that, as I was saying about the article in the New York Times, it really raised the issue of the sort of unspoken need and how to really create quality education for students. And what we're learning more and more in research is that effective learning is not simply about curriculum or lesson plans or discipline strategies. It's not even so much about school climate. It's really a function of the quality of the relationships within a school community. How many of us are actually paying attention to, meaning how well do we actually measure the quality of our relationships? How can we actually talk about and grade the quality of relationships in our schools, in our school communities? So what is important and what I see in these, in a lot of these comments, there's some common themes about how toxicity makes it more challenging to create these kind of quality relationships with teachers and students and teachers among themselves. So I'm going to go to the next slide. So if we think about then toxicity's impact on our teaching workforce, our inability to address social toxins and identify social toxins is having an increasingly challenging impact on our ability to attract and maintain a quality teaching workforce. You may have read this in Education Week in May of last year, on an article, a very good article that's arguing who's taking care of the teachers. And the article makes the profound argument that there's a significant emotional drain of teaching that often goes unacknowledged. The ongoing challenges of discipline, the lack of educational support from leaders, the stress of taking on stress, of listening and trying to support the social emotional needs of students. That oftentimes these issues are a function of create greater stresses and pressures on the teaching workforce. This article, this study was done by the National Center for Education Statistics, and it's trying to understand, well, why are we having such a exodus of teachers leaving the teaching workforce? And I found that this study interesting because it took these 5 factors, and one may think that many teachers and the high turnover rate is a result of low pay, or it's a result of going to find a better job. But what we found is that the top 2 reasons were dissatisfaction and family and personal reasons. What this suggests is that if we think that that we can address the teaching workforce only through financial means, though it's important, that we're missing part of the equation. And that is that teachers are oftentimes leaving the workforce because they don't have the kind of support to support their social emotional needs, the kind of quality of teaching, what makes teaching really matter, the quality of relationships between teachers and students and teachers among themselves, and the stress of teaching oftentimes go unacknowledged and supported in school communities. Another study done by the Penn State was financially supported by the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, similarly found these 4, the top 4 reasons why teachers are leaving. Job satisfaction, too many demands, a lack of leadership and support, and powerless on how schools are run. All of these are increasing stressors on teachers without consideration of the kind of systems of support that are required to transform and provide the social and emotional development and support of our teaching workforce. So then how do we create systems that heal? How do we create healing in our school communities rather than harm? This is I was explaining this phenomena around social toxins to a colleague of mine who's actually a botanist at UC Berkeley. And some of you may have heard me speak before and use this metaphor, but I think it's a very important metaphor for understanding how do we think about creating systems of support for our teaching workforce. So she's a botanist, And I was explaining the results of social toxins and how they create stress. And she said that they have this experiment they do at UC Berkeley. They take these plants and they put them into these chambers. And they take toxic gas and they pump those toxic gas into the chambers, and they measure what happens to the plant. And ultimately, the plant's exposure to physical toxins, that gas, ultimately kills the plant. But she said that they did something different one time. They took a community of plants and they brought those plants together in that same toxic environment, and they pumped the gas into the chamber with this community of plants. And rather than, something miraculous happened when they brought a community of plants together. Rather than the toxic gas killing the plants reacted differently. The plants began to pull different nutrients out of their soil. They began to metabolize those nutrients in a different way. And the plants actually began to emit a gas in the chamber that cleaned up the toxic gas that they were pumping into it. They detoxified their environment. The plants worked together to clean up the toxicity in their environment. And I thought that that was an important metaphor for thinking about how we should be thinking about our own school communities. How are we thinking creatively and courageously about centering healing and integrating healing into the day-to-day work of our teaching workforce and on our students to build well-being into our schools? I was explaining this phenomenon about detoxifying our environment at in Stockton, California, not long ago. And after the talk, I was talking about the necessity of creating healing-centered schools that focus as much as on healing and well-being as they do on learning and education. Schools that center and take seriously the importance of supporting the well-being of everybody in the school community. At the end of the talk, a principal came up to me, and she explained to me that she had heard about these ideas, and she had actually created her own school. She had actually created her own school healing opportunities. Her name was Kristen Buckenman at the El Dorado School in Stockton, California. And what she explained was that there are a significant number of the students and a significant number of the staff were talking the students were exposed to various forms of trauma. They had one counselor for the entire school to support the well-being of their students who had been exposed to trauma, and the teachers themselves were being burnt out. So she said she decided to take an entire classroom and create a healing-centered room. And that room was like a spa. And the room has aromatherapy. There's soft music playing in it. The lights are gentle. There are places to lay down and close their eyes. There are positive affirmations throughout the room. The light covers, if you look at the roof, the ceiling, if you look at the ceiling, the lights are covered in blue soft light so that it's not stark white light in the room. And anyone in that school community, she explained, can go into this room at any time to close their eyes, rest, and be silent. Students can go there at any time. Faculty and staff can go there at any time. And there's only one rule, and that is it has to be completely silent. And she said that she had to create different strategies to support well-being, that just by creating that room, it created a different conversation at the school about the significance of well-being. Turns out that she began to raise money and create other kinds of healing opportunities, but it was the beginning, the first step was creating this room. And it became a signature feature of the school. And it also began to shift the climate at the school to center well-being. She calls it a healing-centered school, and it inspired me, and I was curious to understand how this example might influence your own thinking about creating healing-centered opportunities in your own school. So I'm going to ask you to respond to these two questions in the chat box. It's the first is, what can you learn from this school to support your teacher healing and well-being? And what do you find most interesting about this example? I'm going to just take some time for you to go to your chat box and just respond to the question. And think about how this is relevant, or if it resonates or not, and if it's with your own school environment. I'm going to give you just a couple of more minutes, and then I'll start responding to some of your comments. And I'm glad to see that there's a lot of rich comments and thinking about creating these healing-centered opportunities in schools. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and comment on a couple of your comments. So there are, I'm sort of reading through some of these, and it sounds like some of you have already tried or have integrated these sort of practices in some of your schools. Some of you are really interested in how it's actually structured, what are the costs associated with it, right? Some of you have some concerns and interesting concerns about, it's important to have a space, but how do you actually get healing integrated into the conversations and the practices into the classroom so that it is not a standalone sort of program? All very good comments, right? All very, 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 very important. I think one of the take-homes here that has been shared with me, and this is a quote, I probably should have put it on a slide, and it basically says that teachers need to learn to give from their excess, not give from their essence. And I'll say it again. Teachers should learn to need to give from their excess, not from their essence. That's a quote that her name is Dr. Phillips Hubbard shared with me. And I thought that was really important. And she said that if we continue to give from our essence, that is, we show up for students, we provide the kind of emotional support, and in addition to the academic support, from our essence, but we don't have enough excess built up, then we become drained. And the quote reminds me that the practices in schools need to support building the sort of excess social emotional well-being that's required for the adults to be able to be present to show up with students. Let's see. So what are some of the things that, let me see, there's a question that I have here. What can we do for teachers who have space like this? If we're talking about taking care of teachers, what can we do for them? Well, I think that that there's a couple of things that that this example can teach us and sort of think about. The first is that it places the importance of well-being in the school, right? So even though it's a space, it becomes a significant part of the climate and culture of the school by making sure that well-being stays front and center. Some would argue that this is almost as important as the front and center importance of learning itself. Some would argue, and some of the research even suggests, that you can't actually get to learning until you actually address some of the social emotional well-being issues in school climate, right? The second thing is, I think there are practices that we can engage in, and I'll share some practices a little bit later, that are simple, that allow for teachers and students to actually begin to center well-being into their school community. Simple things like emotional check-ins, simple things about talking about how one is, how their day is going in terms of their emotional state. A third that I've seen really effective is just in staff meetings. Oftentimes we have such a limited time. There's so many things to accomplish and not enough time in the day. What I've seen in staff meetings is that where a principal or a leader of the staff meeting will just simply take some time for teachers to talk a little bit about what's going on in their lives. It's almost like creating, if any of you have been through some of our trainings, that we begin to shift transactional relationships, which are relationships that are based on our titles, and I'll talk a little bit about this later, to transformative relationships, where we begin to know each other a lot differently in a much more deeper way. So when we begin to implement practices like this, we amplify the ability to foster well-being in our communities, in our school communities. So how do we do this? What is the healing-centered approach? So I want to sort of go into a little bit of detail on what we mean by creating a healing-centered approach. And this is important because the principles that I'll talk about are ways that we can begin to think about guiding and implementing strategies to support the well-being of teachers and build healing-centered strategies into our school communities. So a healing-centered approach involves, one, fostering well-being at the individual level, building and fostering interpersonal relationships in communities, and three, changing and transforming the institutions, the policies, and the systems that are causing the harm in the first place. That means oftentimes when we think about creating a school climate, or when we talk about supporting a school or a school district with issues of equity, there's a tendency for us to start at transforming the policies and the values of the policies and the strategies of the institution. But we have to also remember that an institution is nothing more than a set of relationships. So it means that we also have to begin to think about how do we not only change the sort of external mechanistic technical aspects of institutions like policies, But we also have to begin to invest in quality relationships between teachers and students, between teachers and teachers and administrators. But it also means that we have to think about well-being at the individual level, right? How do we actually support the well-being not only of the collective, but at the individual level? A couple of examples. There's a tendency, for example, at the individual level for us in schools to invest in what we call professional development, like this. This is a professional development. Professional development tends to focus on skill building that's relevant to your profession. But what it doesn't always do is it doesn't always foster the personal growth that's necessary to be effective in your profession. So at the individual level, I argue that it's important for schools and school communities to invest in personal growth and development. That's things like learning how to meditate. There was a school district that gave continuing education units to teachers that went out and learned yoga and then came back and taught yoga to teachers and other students, right? So it's sort of transgressing professional development and taking seriously the importance of personal development in a school community to have profound impact on the relationships. Then at the interpersonal level, it means investing in the quality relationships that can actually shift school climate. So you can think about the kind of opportunities that actually foster transformative kinds of relationships. Oftentimes we go to conferences, right? And those conferences, all of us know that what happens at a conference, while the information that happens at a conference is important, it's the relationships, the time spending together that actually build the kind of relationships that matter. So I encourage schools and school districts to think about ways to take teachers and administrative staff on excursions and opportunities to build the kind of team that is necessary to have an impact. That might look like retreats, right? That might look like going to different kinds of adult camps and doing team building activities. But the kind of interpersonal relationships are important. And the third, of course, then are looking at the policies and practices. And that begins with also an understanding of the values. And if I had more time, I could give you examples of how some policies actually make it difficult and sometimes impossible just to integrate well-being into the practice into school communities. I recall doing some work and having presenting in a school district on the East Coast. And a teacher, after we got through with our training, the teacher came up to me and said, you know what, at least once or twice a week, some of the young people will come to my classroom because they've experienced something horrible at home, either that morning or the night before. And what I want to do is give them a hug, but I can't. I can't embrace my students because the policy says that no adult in the school should embrace or touch the students. As an example, while the policy has good intent, it also has a damaging impact because it serves as a barrier for human connection. And so while it's important to sort of look at these policies and understand what those policies are intended to do, we also have to look at the unintended consequence of those policies. So what we do is we use these principles. We call them karma principles. And there are 5 principles to a healing-centered approach. And each of these principles are based in both research and they're based in evidence-based practices that we've seen over and over again in effective building effective healing-centered communities in both nonprofit organizations and schools. The first principle is culture. The second is agency. The third is relationships. The fourth is meaning, and the last is aspiration. So when we talk about transforming culture, we're looking at how do we identify who we are in school communities. It means that we're looking at others, our own and others' humanity, ethnic history, racial and other social identities. It asks questions about who we are, how our identities show up, and how our identities are harmed in these school communities. It means, for example, looking at your own race. and understanding how your race has an impact on a school community. And so if you're a white teacher or a white principal working in a predominantly community of color, it means simply understanding understanding how your racial and ethnic identity shows up in a school community. But culture also means embracing and bringing in culture in a way that is celebratory. It means there's a colleague of mine, Jerry Teo, who's one of the founders of an organization called the National Compadres Network. And one of the things he says is that la cultura cura. In other words, the culture cures. And so by placing culture and understanding the role of culture, across ethnic groups, it provides a place and a safety zone that sometimes can be supportive of the healing of students and teachers in school communities. The second is agency, right? And agency is the individual and collective ability to act, create, and change the root causes of personal, social, and community challenges. It means that well-being is not thought of as only an individual act of self-care. It means that when we take care of ourselves, we're actually taking care of the entire community. Because if I'm well, it has the ability, my wellness is contagious. The research suggests research done in something called social network analysis, is that when we engage in a practice such as well-being, that our own ability to be well becomes contagious. That is, we have an influence on our peers, our peers' well-being. It may mean that if you're practicing yoga or you're practicing meditation, that it may have an influence and the ability to encourage others to do the same. So agency means that we have the ability to take action to claim our own well-being, and that well-being can have an impact on our school communities. The third is relationship. I've already explained that the research suggests that there's two kinds of relationships. There's the transactional relationships that are a function of titles, and then transformative relationships that are a function of our humanity. If you've ever read Brene Brown, of her work, she talks about this notion of vulnerability. If you've read any of her work, she talks about the ability to actually to create these transformative relationships by understanding and bringing our full humanity into our school communities. This means that our relationships, that we have to create the container to build those relationships with both students and with the adults, with adult teachers and administrators. So how do we build those kind of transformative relationships? It means that we have to create different kinds of ways we come together. And so the way that we come together in school communities is largely through meetings, or meetings with parents, staff meetings with students. And meetings, when we have a meeting, it doesn't actually facilitate transformative relationships. Healing circles do. Healing circles are a way that we actually begin to talk about what's happening in our lives. But in order to do that, it is important to create the kind of safety and the container that's necessary to actually have those kind of conversations in school communities. I'll give you some examples in a little bit about how we can scaffold certain practices so that these shifting from transactional relationships to transformative relationships can be done in your school communities. The third is meaning, and meaning is the profound discovery of who we are, where we're going, and what purpose we're born to serve. This means that we have to be very vigilant and think about why we got into this profession. And when we think about meaning making, it allows us to not get influenced by the day-to-day grind of the work that we do. And there's a question that just popped up that Rochelle Hooks has raised. With something like school challenges, schools that have a large amount of staff walking during their lunch. I think what you're asking I'm actually not sure about that question. So if you could clarify, you said with like school, I'm not sure what you mean by school challenges, or large amount of staff walking around during lunch to foster relationships. So I'm gonna assume what you mean by a school site challenge is an opportunity for the school to take a day to create small group conversations about issues that are happening in the young people and adults' lives. If you remember Challenge Day, that organization had done an amazing job of creating those kind of containers to have these kind of conversations. But it also means that it can't just happen one day out of the year or 2 days out of the year. So the extent to having staff build those kind of relationships, if they're walking around during lunch or if they're creating kind of small group conversations during lunch, yes, the answer, Rochelle, is that if the intent is to have those kind of create daily practices where the staff can actually have those kind of conversations with students, then yes, that's an excellent practice to build those kind of transformative relationships. You might also think about having small group kind of personal or small group conversations during lunch period where students can come together and be given conversations or given opportunities to share what's going on in their lives, and also do the same with the staff. The fourth is aspirations. I'm sorry, I think I may have, oh no, the last is aspirations. Aspirations means that there's a tendency in our school communities to focus on the reduction of things that we don't want to see. So we measure a healthy school climate by the reduction of fights. We measure healthy school climate by the reduction of bullying, right? We don't have an aspirational goal to think about and measuring and paying attention to quality relationships. I've said kind of jokingly, what if we had a metric in our schools to measure the quality of relationships if we measure the number of hugs that students received every day, or we measured the amount of compliments that the adult staff give each other every day, right? But aspirations means that we have to see beyond the problem of schools and not be problem-focused as much as we are possibility-focused. I believe that our ability to think about metrics and think about measuring the kind of qualities that we identify as a healthy school climate, once we can begin to measure that, then we can actually scaffold practices that facilitate and enhance and ultimately create the kind of school communities that we want to work in. But aspirations, this last principle, is significant because it really pushes us to not just think of school climate and think about well-being as the reduction of stress, but is actually the enhancing or the increase of belonging and the increase of quality relationships. So those are the 5 principles of karma. And what I want to sort of pause for just a second and talk a little bit about and shift into now what's sort of an implementation guide. And these are some strategies that we think are useful in your actually implementing well-being into your schools. And we call this an implementation guide because they're just guidelines. They're not sort of rules or a cookie-cutter step-by-step process. But what we've done is taking the karma principles, culture, agency, relationships, meaning, and aspiration. And what we tried to do is scaffold them into specific practices that might be useful. So for example, in our implementation guide, we have a suggestion about how do you create the container, right? The climate and the container to having these kind of important transformative relationships that actually build the kind of climates that we want to see. So an opening ritual. In schools, we always just jump into a meeting, right? So the ability to do a check-in is an opening ritual. We might also think about doing check-ins at every class session. Now, I know that many of you are thinking, well, we don't have time to do that. It's not enough time to do a check-in. ultimately what happens is if there's not enough time, you're going to use the time anyway around discipline issues. And so if we take seriously these opening rituals that begin to actually have a reverberating impact on the other kind of issues that show up in classrooms and schools that ultimately take up more time. Then the second is an engaging activity, right? The opening ritual might be just an emotional check-in. An engaging activity might ask students or at your staff meeting to do some journaling about something that's challenging in their life right now. But the idea is to shift the engaging activity from just focusing on work to thinking about issues of well-being. It could be also about an engaging activity could be to have someone, to have your staff share a well-being practice that they're currently engaging in to teach other people how to do it. And then lastly, it might conclude with a reflection, which is how might we integrate some of this in our school community? How might we integrate that into our classroom? Here's an example of an implementation guide that we've used in another school site. So for the culture of the principle of culture, which is the principle to enhance identity and sense of self in relationship to the world. The strategy might be to build shared values, beliefs that co-create culture in settings. Question, how might we create culture using identities and shared values? And so the practice, if you see that in the lower right hand, is to create a culture space in a classroom or program area where young people can bring items that represent their full identity. We call it an altar. It could be something like a picture or a poem or something in nature, but it's something that represents who they are. It represents their identity, something from their family. And it becomes a place that reminds us of our identities and why our identities are important and how they should be how they could show up in classrooms or show up in our staff meetings. So that's an example of an implementation of our implementation guide that we use to give people guide rails of thinking about how to implement these wellness practices into the school community. Anne has asked the question, is the implementation guide online or somewhere in a book? The implementation guide is not online. We use this implementation guide when we're actually engaged in working with schools. And so if you're interested in doing more deeper work in this area, if you downloaded the implementation guide, it wouldn't make much sense because we use coaching and sort of hands-on support for the implementation of some of these concepts. In the next series of slides, however, we do have some recommendations that you can think about to do some of the implementation. And if you're curious and interested in further the further deep dive into implementation and get your hands on an implementation guide, then we have at the last slide shows you how to contact us so that we can talk to you about the kind of unique needs and interests you have in doing in building a healing center school or school community. I hope I answered your question, Ann. So what are some of the recommendations on building a healing-centered approach in your school community? And there are a few. The first is we have to increase the organizational supports to integrate healing practices into the day-to-day engagement with our students and with our adult staff, right? So we oftentimes use our professional development funds, our professional development budget, to allocate staff to go to different professional development opportunities. For example, the one we're in now. But if we think creatively about healing, then it means that we have to actually allocate some of those supports to support the growth, the sort of personal healing strategies for staff. I gave you some examples. Another example that I've seen a school or district actually provide is that they did continuing education units. I gave you the example of the teachers going and using yoga, but there's also a school district gave continuing education units for students, for teachers who went out and learned meditation. I also seen school districts create teacher sabbaticals where teachers would be able to, if they had a certain amount of tenure, they would go out learn a practice for a couple of months, and then come back and then be responsible for the training of that practice for the entire school community. But creating organizational supports provides an opportunity to take seriously and raise the priority in allocating resources to well-being. The second is to build systems to support for teachers to strengthen their own social emotional growth and well-being. If we're thinking about systems of support, that means we're not only providing teachers with tools around curriculum, not only tools for academic growth, for the academic strategies that they're engaged in, but we're also thinking about allowing for teachers to have support around their own social emotional growth. Healing circles at schools for teachers, providing opportunities for teachers to create their own support groups in schools and school districts, providing not just mental health for teachers, but also creating these sort of healing networks where teachers from across the district might be sharing wellness practices with each other. All of these are systems of support that ultimately create a network that supports the well-being of the teacher workforce in a school district or school. I mentioned this earlier, which is to develop and track measures of wellness in schools or district-wide. And so it's important, right, that we prioritize well-being. This is an example of a healing-centered organizational assessment. If you were engaged with us, we'd come into your school or we would come into your district, and we would use this assessment to just get a snapshot of the organization or the school well-being. And so we want to actually take a second for you to go to your chat box, and I hope you can read some of this. Is a sample of our assessment. It breaks down well-being at 3 levels, as we talked about: the personal level, the individual level, the interpersonal level, and at the institutional level. And it asks questions about well-being at each of those levels. So if it's a red, at the red light, if you circle red, that means this is completely not present for me in my school or in my relationships or with me personally. Yellow kind of means sort of, and green means absolutely. So for example, at the personal level, I take time to think about what's important in my life, about who I am, what I value, where I fit in, and where I'm going. I recognize when I'm stressed and take steps to relax through exercise, quiet time, and other activities. So if you look at red light, yellow light, or green light, you would just simply circle or check the box that's appropriate for that response. So we want to just take a second for you to go to the chat box and pick one of the areas of what you would check on any of the levels. If you were to fill this out, where would you assess yourself, at the red, yellow, or green? Where would you assess your relationships with your peers and other teachers? And where would you assess your institution, your school, or your school district at each of those levels? So if you can go to the chat box for just a second, you don't have to go to each and every question, but just select one, and you could reply. For question 4, I would select yellow, or for question 5, I would select green, so that you can just see how the assessment might work for you. I'll take a second for you to respond. Great. I'm seeing a lot of green at the interpersonal, which sounds like that the relationships you have with your colleagues seem to be in green. I'm seeing both yellow and red at the institution, which is that there may be policies and practices that support health and well-being of its workers, kind of, sort of, or it might be completely missing. I'll take a couple more minutes and then move on. Thanks, Mike. Mike Weber, you said institutionally probably lots of yellow. Great. So thank you for your response, and this gives us a lot of, I could see that the assessment, if we were to support with thinking about creating a healing-centered strategy in your school or school district, this assessment, which is a couple of pages, would be taken by a number of folks, but it allows you to sort of think about and how to develop and track measures of well-being in your school. But it also becomes, it becomes a way that we could do this, this assessment over and over again, so that we begin to track these things and not just think about well-being and school climate in a sort of a vague sense, but we actually have metrics to begin to track and measure some of these things. Let me move on to some other recommendations. The next recommendation is create healing-centered, not trauma-informed opportunities for students. There's an article that I wrote that came out late last June, early July, called Shifting from Trauma-Centered Care to Healing-Centered Engagement. And it simply makes the argument that while trauma-informed care is important, it is insufficient to actually foster healing. And it gives, in the article I make a number of arguments, but the most important is that trauma-informed care tends to treat the symptoms that young people and students bring to our schools, and as opposed to creating an environment that focuses on healing. If you look at the chat, thank you, Susan, for putting up the article, but you could take a look at that article, and it provides a much more substantive explanation about why healing-centered strategies are important. It doesn't say we should not use trauma-informed care. It says that it's simply incomplete, and that along with trauma-informed care, a healing-centered strategy, one that focuses on the entire school community, one that doesn't focus only on the symptoms of trauma, but focuses on creating opportunities for well-being, is one that we need to pay greater attention to. The next is creating an equity-based social-emotional learning strategy in the school. Means that we need to think about social-emotional learning, that there's a lot of work happening in California about social-emotional learning, and it simply says that we have to create an equity lens on social-emotional learning. That means when we understand the unique needs of our student population, the racial demographics, the issues of poverty, it means that social-emotional learning means something different, right? And that we can't use one size fits all social-emotional strategy. So, for example, students who are English language learners, may have an accent, right? It means that social-emotional learning may mean developing a sense of pride and a sense of accomplishment in their English language learning, instead of a sense of shame around their English language accent, right? That means that social-emotional growth is unique to their own ethnic experience. It might mean that for LGBTQ students, that they develop a sense of identity and a sense of pride around their gendered identity, and not necessarily only focusing on the harm, but the social-emotional growth is developed, maybe focused on their own unique identities and that they bring to the school communities. So I want to, the last is then support the educational leaders with transformative change over professional development. I've said this before, right, that while professional development is important, we also have to invest in the personal development of our teaching workforce. And and not restricting our resources and our opportunities to only the professional aspects of our lives, but creating a holistic and seeing teachers in a holistic perspective and investing in the complete human development of our teacher workforce. I want to end with a quote from Michelle Alexander, who, in my view, is one of the most brilliant legal minds of our time. She wrote a book called The New Jim Crow, which documents the ways in which our society has continued slavery through the criminal justice system. And despite the fact that she has written numerous articles on legal issues that face young people and our society, she decided to stop practicing law, and she enrolled in the Union Theological School in New York. And the reason she did, she says, is that she can't simply address the fundamental issues of our society through a legal lens. This is not simply a legal problem or a political problem or a policy problem. At its core, America's problems raise profound moral and spiritual questions about who we are, who we aim to become, and what we're willing to do now. I think the same challenge is for us as educators, that we cannot simply see education as only a strategy for learning, that the issues that we're facing in our schools, among our teachers and among our students, cannot be addressed only by focusing on more curriculum, greater testing, and the kind of mechanical strategy that we see in our schools. But we have to do just as Michelle Alexander has done. That is, dig deep and think about what are the most important issues in our schools that extend beyond our conventional ways of thinking about education, and how do we begin to invest in those. I want to thank you for your time, and thank you for the opportunity to share these ideas. If you have more questions or more questions and want some more resources about how to build a healing-centered school, you can simply go to www.flourishagenda.com, and that's the website that we use to really talk about this work. And if you're interested in learning more, you could reach me or reach anybody from the Flourish Agenda team to provide more information about how we might support you with creating healing-centered strategies in your own work. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Gray. It was really wonderful having you here sharing with us today. We do have time if folks want to drop anything into chat. We have a few more minutes for that, but in the meantime, Sharon is going to give you a little bit more information before we leave.
So our next webinar is with a mystery guest. Well, if you don't mind, please hold it on your calendar for April 10th, 2019 at the same time. We thank Connie Silva, Project Director, Jen DeShazer, Coordinator, Davina Gallen, Administrative Assistant, and Susan Stewart, Educational Technology Manager. And certainly we want to thank Dr. Ginwright for sharing his time and his wisdom with us this afternoon. And we invite you always to contact us at SPP-TAP to further your work on equity in your school.
Thank you, Sharon, for the opportunity, and I want to say, thank you for the opportunity to get these ideas out there, and you guys continuing to provide the kind of technical assistance we need in California.
Our pleasure. Thank you.
And for everyone else, we've got an evaluation that we'd like you to fill out. The link is in the chat box. It will also be popping up on your screen momentarily. Thanks, everyone. Have a great day.
Thank you.